There is a particular kind of soldier that every army in every war produces in small numbers. The kind that other soldiers follow not because of rank or orders or the threat of consequences, but because of something harder to define and impossible to fake. The kind of leader that men will follow into situations that every rational instinct says are unsurvivable, not out of blind obedience, but out of a specific and earned trust that this person will not waste their lives, that this person will find a way through when no way appears to exist, that this person has done it before and will do it again. Herbert Gille was exactly this kind of soldier, and his story is one of the most remarkable combat records of the entire Second World War. He was one of the most decorated officers in the Waffen-SS, a man who fought on the Eastern Front from the first days of Barbarossa to the last weeks of the war, who broke his division out of one of the most catastrophic encirclements of the entire conflict, who was sent to do the impossible so many times that the impossible started to look like his natural operating environment. The Wehrmacht generals who worked alongside him, men who had no particular reason to admire SS officers and often had every professional reason to resent them, respected Gille in a way they withheld from most of his peers. His own men, the soldiers of the Wiking Division and later the 4th SS Panzer Corps, followed him with the particular devotion that soldiers reserve for commanders who have proven in blood and fire that they will not abandon them. This is his story, and it is told not to celebrate the organization he served or the regime behind it, but because understanding what happened on the Eastern Front requires understanding the men who fought there, including the ones who fought on the wrong side with genuine and extraordinary skill. Herbert Gille was born on March 8, 1897, in Gandersheim, in Lower Saxony, into a family with military traditions that pointed him toward a soldier's life from early on. He was part of the generation that came of age just in time for the First World War, young enough to go in as a teenager, old enough to come out the other side as something fundamentally different from what he had been before. He served as an artillery officer, developed the technical precision and the spatial understanding of the battlefield that artillery demands, and came back from the war with the experience and the instincts that would define his approach to combat for the rest of his career. Between the wars, he stayed connected to military life, and when the SS began building its military formations in the mid-1930s, he joined and began the progression through ranks that would eventually bring him to divisional and then corps command. By the time Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, Gille was a senior officer in the SS Division Wiking, a formation built largely around volunteers from occupied and neutral European countries, Scandinavians and Dutch and Flemish and other Western Europeans who had volunteered to fight against the Soviet Union, for a variety of reasons that ranged from genuine ideological conviction to simple adventure-seeking to anti-communist sentiment that predated any particular attachment to Nazi ideology. The Wiking Division was, by the standards of Waffen-SS formations, a genuinely capable military unit, and it was thrown into the fighting on the Eastern Front from the very beginning of Barbarossa. What the Eastern Front was like in those first months is difficult to convey adequately to anyone who has not studied it in detail. The scale of the operations, the distances involved, the intensity of the fighting, the casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic by the standards of any previous conflict, but that became a grinding routine on the Russian steppe and in the Russian forests. Gille fought through all of it, commanding first at the regimental level and then increasingly at higher levels as the war ground on. And the Viking division accumulated the combat experience and the casualties that transformed it from a formation of enthusiastic volunteers into one of the most battle-hardened units on the Eastern Front. His reputation as a commander crystallized through years of continuous combat, and what that reputation rested on was something specific and consistent. Gille led from the front. This sounds like a simple thing, almost a cliché, but in the context of the Eastern Front, it meant something very precise and very demanding. It meant being present at the point of decision when the fighting was at its most intense. It meant knowing the ground because he had personally walked it, or driven over it, or been shot at on it, rather than studying it on a map in a headquarters 20 kilometers behind the line. It meant that his soldiers saw him in the places where the danger was real, which did the thing that no amount of inspiring speeches or formal authority can do. It told them that he understood what he was asking of them, because he was there, asking it while standing in the same place they were standing. Artillery officers develop a particular relationship with terrain and with the management of fire that translates well to higher command, and Gille brought that technical precision to everything he did. The careful calculation of what was possible, the exact understanding of how much a unit could be pushed before it broke. The instinct for the moment when pushing harder would produce results, and the moment when it would produce only casualties. In 1943, he was given command of the Viking division itself, and in January 1944, he and his division found themselves inside what would become one of the defining encirclements of the entire Eastern Front, the Korsun-Cherkassy Pocket, known to German soldiers simply as the Cherkassy Pocket, a catastrophe in slow motion that trapped approximately 60,000 German soldiers in a shrinking perimeter as Soviet forces closed in from all sides. The Korsun encirclement was the Eastern Front's answer to Stalingrad. Another massive pocket, another surrounded force, another situation where the men inside were dependent on relief from outside and supply from the air, while the Soviets methodically tightened the ring. The difference between Korsun and Stalingrad, the difference that meant that most of the men in the Korsun pocket survived, while most of the men in Stalingrad did not, was the breakout. And the breakout happened largely because of what Gille and his division did. The situation inside the pocket by February 1944 was desperate in the specific way that encirclements become desperate after weeks of attrition. Ammunition running low, food running short, wounded accumulating faster than they could be evacuated, the perimeter shrinking under constant Soviet pressure, the air supply falling far short of what the encircled forces needed. Relief attempts from outside the pocket were pushing in, but could not break through the Soviet lines completely. The decision was made to attempt a breakout, to concentrate the remaining combat power of the encircled forces and punch through the Soviet encirclement before the pocket collapsed entirely. This was the kind of operation that looks straightforward on a map and is savage beyond description on the ground. A force that has been under siege for weeks, weakened and exhausted and running short of everything, trying to fight its way through prepared Soviet defensive positions in winter conditions, in snow and cold that killed men who stopped moving, while carrying its wounded and trying to maintain enough coherence to actually function as a military force, rather than disintegrating into a mob of individuals trying to escape individually. Gille's Viking division was one of the formations at the tip of the breakout attempt, and what he did in those days, in February 1944, is the centerpiece of his military reputation. He drove his division with everything it had, through the Soviet lines, through the snow and the cold and the fire, keeping his men moving when stopping meant dying, finding the weak points in the Soviet positions and exploiting them with the aggressive precision that characterized everything he did. The breakout succeeded. Approximately 35,000 German soldiers made it through the Soviet lines and reached the German lines on the other side. Not the 60,000 who had been encircled, because weeks of fighting in the pocket had cost thousands of casualties before the breakout even began, and the breakout itself cost more. But 35,000 men who might have died in a pocket the way 330,000 men had died in Stalingrad walked out of the Korsun encirclement because the breakout worked. Gille was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest decoration in the German military, awarded to fewer than 30 men in the entire war, for his role in making it work. The Eastern Front did not pause to allow anyone to recover from one crisis before generating the next one. By the summer and autumn of 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically for Germany. The Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, had essentially destroyed Army Group Center in one of the largest military disasters in the history of warfare. And the front was collapsing in ways that created emergency after emergency, requiring whatever fire brigade forces Germany could assemble. Gille had been given command of the 4th SS Panzer Corps, a larger formation that included the Viking Division and other units, and this corps became exactly the kind of fire brigade force that the deteriorating situation demanded, moved from crisis point to crisis point, thrown into the worst situations on the front, expected to stabilize what had collapsed and hold what was disintegrating. It is a kind of operational role that destroys formations through attrition, even when it succeeds tactically, and Gille's corps was ground down steadily through the second half of 1944, even as it performed the missions it was assigned. The final major operation of Gille's war came in early 1945 in Hungary in the attempt to relieve Budapest. The Hungarian capital had been encircled by Soviet forces in late December 1944, with approximately 70,000 German and Hungarian soldiers trapped inside the city, along with the civilian population. Hitler refused to allow the garrison to break out, insisting that Budapest be held as a fortress, the same decision he had made about Stalingrad 2 years earlier, with the same logic and heading toward the same outcome. 3 separate relief attempts were organized, and Gille's 4th SS Panzer Corps was the spearhead of 2 of them. The first attempt in January 1945 came within 20 kilometers of the city before Soviet resistance and the exhaustion of the attacking forces stopped it. The second attempt pushed even closer before it too was halted. Budapest fell on February 13, 1945. The garrison that had been promised relief was destroyed. The pattern of Stalingrad had repeated itself. Gille continued fighting through the final weeks of the war, his corps retreating westward as the Soviet advance pushed deeper into Central Europe. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and spent several years in Allied captivity before being released. Unlike many senior SS officers, whose post-war legal situations were complicated by involvement in war crimes, Gille's case was focused primarily on his role as a combat commander rather than on atrocities, and he was eventually released and lived out his post-war life in West Germany. He became involved in the network of Waffen-SS veterans organizations that formed in post-war Germany. Organizations that worked to distinguish the Waffen-SS from the General SS, and to argue that the combat soldiers of the Waffen-SS should be understood as soldiers rather than criminals. He died on December 26, 1966, in Stemmen, at the age of 69. The question that any honest account of Herbert Gille has to address is the question that any honest account of Waffen-SS commanders has to address, and it is a question without a clean answer. Gille was, by every measure available to assess such things, an exceptional combat commander, tactically skilled, personally brave, genuinely devoted to the welfare of his men in the specific and demanding way that the best combat leaders always are. The men who served under him remembered him with the kind of loyalty and respect that soldiers reserve for commanders who earned it. The Wehrmacht officers who worked alongside him respected his professional competence in a context where professional competence was the only currency that mattered. That is all real. And the organization he served committed crimes of a scale and a deliberateness that have no parallel in modern history. And he served that organization loyally and effectively from the beginning to the end. He wore the SS uniform. He commanded SS formations. He contributed his exceptional professional skills to the military effort of a regime whose defining project was the systematic murder of millions of people. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the honest position is to hold both of them rather than allowing one to erase the other. What Gille represents on the Eastern Front is something that military historians return to repeatedly because it matters for understanding how the war actually worked. The gap between tactical excellence and moral accountability. The way that genuine military skill can exist completely independently of the justice of the cause it serves. The uncomfortable fact that some of the most impressive military performances of the entire war were delivered by men fighting for the worst regime in modern history. Gille broke 35,000 men out of an encirclement that should have killed them all. He did it with skill and courage and leadership of a genuinely high order. And he did it in service of Adolf Hitler's Germany, in a war that Germany started, wearing the uniform of an organization whose crimes were unlike anything the world had seen. The 35,000 men who walked out of the Korsun pocket were real. The millions of victims of the organization whose uniform he wore were also real. History does not resolve that tension neatly. It simply holds both facts and asks you to understand them together, which is considerably harder than resolving them in either direction, but considerably closer to the truth.